All right, welcome to the season two premiere, I guess, of Interior Analysis. I'm Evan Westman, and today I'm joined by returning guest Jelani Kelly
Hello.
and two Drexel screenwriting professors, Matt Kaufhold
Hi, everybody.
and David Greenberg.
Hey there.
So today's going to be a little bit of a non-traditional episode. Normally we just go through and look at one movie and kind of dissect everything that's good about it and sometimes a little bit of what's bad, but usually what's good. But today we're not looking at just one movie. In a way, we're kind of looking at all of them. And I do kind of mean that it's sort of all of them. Today we're going to be talking about three-act structure, which is, if you've never heard of this concept, we're probably going to walk you through it enough that you'll have some kind of understanding, but we're also going to go way more in depth. So there might be a few things that if you've never heard of it, I don't think you'll be lost, but there might be some terms that are unfamiliar. So if you're interested in more, go pick up, I guess, any basic screenwriting book and it'll probably lay it out for you. But also just for if you've never heard of it, this is a little bit of a red pill, blue pill moment because it might start ruining movies for you a little bit and that it'll make them more predictable and it'll raise your standards a bit. So I'm not going to try to keep people from listening to this, but I'm just warning you that there might be some, I guess, side effects from learning what this is. So also just a quick spoiler warning for a few movies that we might dissect for into three acts. We're not definitely going to spoil these, but it's possible. So the ones that I have prepared are Black Panther, Shrek, Love, Simon, Good Will Hunting, the first Kingsman movie, and then David, I think you wanted to talk about Spider-Man, the 2002 one, and School of Rock. So are there any others that you guys are planning on? It's okay if you don't know and we end up spoiling them later. That's fine. But are there any others you want to give a warning for?
Not really.
Everyone should have seen these by now.
Yeah, I tried. I guess not everyone has seen all of these, but they're pretty well known. I don't think spoilers should be too much of a problem. I just have a list of questions here, and we're going to try to get through as many as we can. So first question is, how did you guys all first come across the term of three-act structure? So Matt, why don't we start with you?
Well, I think my answer is probably going to be pretty similar to a lot of other people's. I first started learning, at least in detail, about three-act structure when I was in film school and taking my original screenwriting classes. Then I started doing a lot more reading about it and really trying to figure out how the concepts of three-act structure could help me with my own writing and the scripts that I was creating.
So what books were available at that time? Because there have been a lot that have come out in the last 15 years, I think. And even some that I found some that were from this decade. It's progressed a lot. So what kind of stuff was there at the time?
It's a good question because there's a proliferation of these kind of manuals on the marketplace right now. And to a certain extent, all of them are going to boil down to kind of the same thing. When I first started looking into this, I guess Sid Field and Robert McKee were ascendant at that point. So I sort of read through the stuff that they were talking about. I also went back and read the original Aristotle Poetics that most of this in its modern form is at least loosely based on.
Okay, we'll throw it over to David. How did you first hear about it?
Somebody gave me Sid Field when I was in college, and I hated it. I don't know if I'm jumping the gun here, but I just hated the idea that you could take the art of cinema and boil it down to, a sort of mathematical equation. But, it was 19, 20, 21, and sort of just full of snot. I think I literally threw it across the room.
That was Sid Field, right?
That was Sid Field, yeah.
Okay, and Jelani, how did you first come across it?
It was actually in the screenwriting 1 class that I had with David. That was the first time I think I ever heard that. I think I knew movies had a structure, but I didn't know that most of them followed this three-act structure. Yeah, in his class, it was actually the class that I decided to actually switch to screenwriting as a major. He gave us plenty of examples, and some of the movies we'll be discussing today. Yeah, it was in screenwriting 1 sophomore year.
Yeah. I like that you brought up that you kind of knew what it was, because I think that's kind of something that maybe for some of our listeners that have never heard of this before, that's kind of true of it too. Like everyone, I think, kind of has a sense of what three act structure is. They just don't necessarily have the terminology for it. I first came across it through this. I guess it was a version of Save the Cat. It wasn't actually Save the Cat, but it was like it's a book called Story Maps. It was like a version of the beat sheet, but a little bit less dogmatic. I really started looking into it after that. You kind of can't go back after you hear about it, I think, or at least I found that that was true.
Can I interject there?
Sure.
Just to say that I think you're absolutely right that most people sort of understand this on an intuitive level simply because so much of what we look at in the entertainment world in general is based around a three-act structure. Even if doesn't follow Blake Snyder or anybody in particular, but the concept of things being organized into a beginning, middle, and end is stuff that it permeates almost everything we watch. So that, most people, you're right, they don't necessarily talk about it in that way, but they are prepared to recognize it when they see it and are sometimes thrown off balance if they don't see it.
Yeah, and I find that like sometimes I think people try to come up with their own names for it. If you pause a movie partway through and someone's like, "Oh, where are you at?" I'm at like the beginning of the end. So like I think what they mean there is like in like the structural term is like the end of Act 2. So they kind of know, they have a sense that like that's where they're at. They just don't necessarily have like the technical term for it. So I guess the first order of business, if we haven't confused anyone who isn't familiar with this already, is what do we mean when we use the term three-act structure? We've touched on this a little bit, but I think just before we go forward anymore, we kind of have to figure out what we mean by it. David, why don't you take the first stab at that one?
Well, at the most basic level, three-act structure is beginning, middle, and end. Most stories have a beginning, middle, and end, and it's the same with movies. With movies, it gets a little bit different. It's different, I think, from a novel. Introduce the protagonist, the situation, the world of the film, have an inciting incident that gets things off to a start. At the end of the first act, you make a conscious decision to take action. Somewhere, I don't know how micro we want to get if we want to talk about, I'm totally blanking on the term. Quick, what's a word for an event halfway through the first half of Act 2? Oh, a pinch, that's what it is. Where the antagonist flexes his or her muscles, then a midpoint, another pinch. End of Act 2 is the beginning of the end or false climax, and then an end where there's resolution.
So why do we think this is like so appealing, or at least so broadly used? Because there's schools of thought who say like, don't fight me on the fact that three-act structure, it doesn't exist, because like even for examples that people cite, like No Country for Old Men or Pulp Fiction or something like that, people will say, no, that still falls under three-act structure, even if like the writer didn't try to use it necessarily. So like, why do we think this is found so much?
Let me say a couple things about that, which is that for anybody who's listening who wants to be a writer versus anybody out there who's a film fan, the answer is maybe slightly different, because it's a different approach to take a film that's been already made and try and figure out whether it has a three-act structure. It's kind of like if you're looking hard enough, you'll find what you're looking for. But if you're a writer and you're staring at a blank page, the question is, how can I make use of this and not feel constrained by what's essentially basic storytelling structure? So I think that's important to keep in mind, that depending upon which lens you're looking, things look very different. And I also think the other thing, when you start analyzing three-act structure, and you can, read stuff that's been written on this from numerous angles, but basically if you look at any kind of written storytelling ever since we started writing things down, it falls into a loose three-act structure. It may not have all the particular points that we're talking about with the various screenwriting gurus who give you the beat sheet and the formula to follow, but those basic three acts are in most of the stories and myths and legends that we're still reading today.
Right. And I think the difference with screenwriting, and at least with the books that are written about it, is that we kind of have more of a constraint on us because a story in general, you can kind of tell it at any length that you want. For novels, you can have anything from 100 pages to 1,000 pages. But for a movie, theoretically, we kind of have to keep it within like 90 minutes to, I mean, some go as far as 3 hours, but most don't. In some books, they'll say you have to have this happen, or you should have it happen around this page number. In Save the Cat, I hadn't read this until I started preparing for this episode, but Blake Snyder's like super dogmatic about that. He's like, you have to have your inciting incident happen by page 12. You have to have your end of Act 1 turn by page 25. The issue I found in that book is that he doesn't justify it. He's just like, it has to happen this way. And like, shut up, don't fight me on this. And I don't know if there's necessarily a point that I'm trying to make with that, but it just seems like maybe a reason why we see movies as more formulaic than other things, because it's like, I think one of you used the term like mathematical structure that like breaks it down into this page number, and like the audience will feel uncomfortable or lose interest if you don't do it by this point. Do any of you want to elaborate on that at all?
I'm going to jump in quick just to say that I think you're right about some of that, and I think some of the books are designed to help you get through some of the industry gatekeepers. If you have a reader who's reading your script and they don't see something happening major between page 25 and 30, there's a chance that they're going to not pass your script along. Because I think the structure is so ingrained in the way they're evaluating properties and materials that's part of why the books are structured that way anyway.
Yeah, I agree with that. I'll jump in on that too. And something I've often wondered about, I don't have an answer for this, is which came first? The concept, we all know that there's an unwritten rule in the business where anybody will read the first 10 pages of any screenplay, and if after 10 pages it's not doing X, Y, and Z, ticking off these boxes, they stop reading it. And I don't know what came first, that writers were front-loading their first 10 pages with all these things, or that once they heard about the suits, the industry people only reading the first 10 pages, they just made sure to write a killer first 10 pages.
I don't think we're going to find a solid answer to that, but it's an interesting theory. So that's, I was planning to ask this later, but I think it makes more sense to now. How did you all kind of approach structure beforehand? The past few months I've been working remotely for like a screenplay competition where I read some of these scripts, and like the writers clearly haven't learned 3-act structure, and they like take 25 pages to have anything significant happen. I think in that sense I get what you're saying with like the industry people. Like that's not usually the first warning sign. They're clearly like not really familiar with the format, so it's not the first red flag that has been going up for me in this job. But I would like to look into like, how did all of us approach structure prior to learning 3-act structure? Jay, why don't we throw it over to you first for that one?
So what I would do, and like I said, wasn't introduced to any 3-act structure until I was interested in screenwriting. Like when I was applying for the screenwriting major, I told Matt that I was working on a few scripts, but I had no idea what the structure was. So I would just write whatever I felt was right. Like, oh, we haven't had action in a while, so let's add an action scene here. So my writing had no sort of direction, and I actually never finished those scripts I was working on. But there was like no plot twists or anything, and I was on like, page 40, and everything was just in the wrong spot as far as the structure goes. I didn't go too deep into world building in either of them. It was a mess. So I'm glad I did learn about it eventually, and I think it did enhance my writing ability.
Do you think there was any kind of approach that you took, even if it was kind of a vague one? Do you think there was any kind of sense of like wanting to have something happen like at a certain point as opposed to like compared to another beat in your story.
Yeah, a little bit. Like I would have. It wasn't really a beat sheet. It was more of like an outline with plot twists and stuff like that. I would make sure there was stuff that led up to that. I wanted some sort of structure to it, but I didn't know what that structure was.
Like you wanted to make sure it was like following a logical order, it sounds
Yeah,
like.
yeah.
But you had to get it to that point.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like that was a little similar to my approach where I was just kind of thinking about like what would logically happen next, kind of, and maybe thinking about like maybe a couple of points down the line that I wanted to get to, like a couple of major scenes or whatever. David, what about you? Did you kind of have a approach to structure at all before learning the 3-act one?
Yeah, well, like I said, I rejected Sid Field when I first got it. And a few years later, I think I very deliberately and defiantly set out to try to prove him wrong. And so would deliberately try to avoid anything resembling 3-act structure, usually with pretty mixed results. It was a mix of attitude, but also ignorance. I think in part I rejected Sid Field and 3-act structure because I didn't understand it at first, and I just couldn't learn it. It was a little too mathy for me. But I also didn't like the idea that there was this prescribed structure that a screenplay had to take. So I would just write and write and write. And I had sort of minimal conflict and structure. And I mean, I kind of like movies about people sitting around and talking. But I realized if I wanted to do this for a living, I was going to have to up my game and learn it. And to tell the truth, I really only learned it very well when I started teaching it at Drexel.
Really?
Mm-hmm. Well, which I left off the job application. Does not know 3-act structure.
Yeah. I learned it prior to coming in. I think at the time that I took your class, I was kind of at the point where I was like, oh, 3-act structure, like I'm beyond that or whatever, which
I relate.
Not really the best attitude to have, I guess, because I was kind of taking like too vague of an approach to structure at that point. I think it was good to like go back. I mean, it wasn't for your class because we didn't have time to write like a full script, but then later in the program for screenwriting too, we have to write like a 90-page script, and at least for mine, we had to stick to basically, I don't think it was exactly like the Blake Snyder beat sheet, but I remember a lot of those same terms being thrown around, like, Dark Night of the Soul, debate. So Matt, what's your answer to that?
My answer is actually sort of a hybrid of both of those, because like Jelani, when I first started out, I had a lot of trouble finishing things. I had a lot of half a script or maybe 3/4 of a script. But also I had a lot of like 15 and 20 page fragments that I couldn't seem to work out. And when I started doing some reading, I thought of Sid Field initially like David. I didn't have as extreme a reaction to it as he did, but I was resistant to the formula side of it. And I did a lot of thinking about that and came and looked at a lot of films. And the way I came around to it was thinking about it not so much as a formula to be used, because if you do try and just plug things in, you end up with sort of a generic script. But I looked at it more as a foundation that I could use to sort of build me through the writing process. And that's really how I came to it. So I can talk about 3-act structure and all the different variations and all the hardcore page counts that people give you and everything else. But for me, these things are only useful in helping you get through writing that draft. And in that sense, having the structure of 3 acts is very helpful for organizing your story and sticking with and completing the project.
So you kind of used it as not so much like a guideline to start from, but more something to fall back on if you kind of got stuck somewhere.
Yeah, and also how to balance out my story. With my early writing, I tried to jam everything into the first act. And that wasn't working, because then stuff that should have been spread out and required more space and time, I wasn't giving because I just didn't understand how to pace things out across the 3 acts. So for me, it's always been sort of a resource. It's sort of putting shape on the project, because I think it was David maybe earlier talked about, how different stories can go in different places, or maybe it was you, Evan. Novels can be 100 pages or 1,000, but structure is what can help you navigate each different medium. Sometimes you have a story that's just not right for a feature film. It's got to be, a limited series because it requires that extra time. So it's partially structure's a way of, framing your story for the right medium.
I think that's a good way of putting it. Before we get too much deeper into this, I think it'd probably be good for our listeners who haven't heard of this before. We can just give a couple of quick examples of movies that do follow 3-act structure and how they do it. David, I'm kind of looking to you on this one, just since I think you probably have the most experience in that out of all of us.
Well, I think Matt's retired from Screenwriting 1, aren't you? I think, which is, I can understand. I actually, of all things, I really like teaching Screenwriting 1. I really like teaching intro. And I should say, I've really come to appreciate and embrace 3-act structure as a tool. Not every film needs it. Some films benefit from not using it. I was just telling somebody the other day, when I saw that Reese Witherspoon film a few years ago, Wild.
I don't think I've heard of that one, but okay.
Yeah, it was out a few years ago. It's directed by the guy who does Big Little Lies and that stuff. I came out of that thinking, wow, that film could have really benefited from 3-act structure. It would have been so much better if it had followed 3-act structure, which I almost never say. But, we think in terms of, people have said, this isn't an original thought, I've heard it from somewhere else. Think of your protagonist, think of your film as a before and after ad. You start out one way and you end up another way, usually better.
So can you just walk us through the beats of one example movie, or maybe a couple, just for the listeners who haven't heard of that before?
Well, one of the classic examples, and you'll know this from class, I use is Avatar. He starts out as a paralyzed Marine mourning the death of his brother, his twin brother, but he's still an active duty Marine. He's still down for the cause. He's still ready to obtain the unobtainium. He's a warmonger still. At the end of the movie, he's an able-bodied, 8-foot-tall Smurf, basically a tree-hugging hippie environmentalist. So that's a dramatic change. But specifically the beats. Well, in character building, I think this is tied into 3-act structure. Your character has to have a flaw, has to have an internal goal that they don't know has to be resolved, but then an external goal that they have to resolve. And over the course of trial and error, successes and failures, they have a new outlook that brings resolution.
Right, and the structure at least in some versions, it's pitched as a guideline for how to bring your character from A to B.
Exactly. And they're different. I've seen it done different ways. Usually it's mostly over the course of 90 minutes or something, but I do make the point that in the first Iron Man movie, Tony Stark grows and changes halfway through the movie. Literally, I think 45 minutes into the movie, he says, I had my eyes opened. I came to realize that I have more to offer the world than just making things that blow up. So he has his big change midway through the movie. Then the rest of the movie's just about flying around in a metal suit.
So you think his arc is finished basically by, I guess you could call it the midpoint?
Basically, in terms of his growth and change. And he says it explicitly. Earlier in the movie, he says, I'd be out of a job if there was peace, because he's a weapons manufacturer. And, not half an hour later, he says, I'm shutting down the weapons manufacturing division of Stark Enterprises. So that's a pretty big change. but it happens halfway through the movie.
Do you think that's maybe not necessarily a completion of his arc, but maybe just a progression of it? Because the midpoint, a lot of people will say that the midpoint is kind of where your character has like his biggest realization, but it's not like complete yet. A couple examples of it, like the midpoint of Shrek, the way I see it, is like he rescues Fiona. I don't know if that's exactly a realization, but like it's a major turning point where like he starts moving more towards like the person he's going to be at the end.
Well, that's a good point. It is a period of self-realization. The midpoint in Spider-Man is where the old one is where Peter Parker decides to become a crime fighter instead of, he initially uses his powers to essentially chase after a girl.
You think that's the midpoint and not the end of Act 1?
Well, actually,
we don't have to debate it too much.
That's the funny thing. I always ask when I talk about Spider-Man in that class, I always say, does anybody know what happens on page 28, between page 28 and page 30? And everyone says Uncle Ben dies or he becomes Spider-Man. Usually, one of my big things, and I only fairly recently learned this, is that the Act 1 decision that the character makes is usually a bad decision that leads to crashing and burning at the end of Act 2.
In a way, it's kind of progress too. Sometimes I think I agree with that. It usually is a bad decision, but like ultimately, if they like never made that choice, they also probably wouldn't change in the end.
Right, it's a bad decision for the sake of the plot. If it was a good decision and everything worked out in the end, you'd probably have a pretty short movie. The end would come pretty quickly.
Well, right, because like I think there's a case to be made that like they have an opportunity to kind of clear up everything. I think a good example of that from some of the examples I was looking at is like Love, Simon. At the end of Act 1, he's getting pressure from this other kid to like, he's basically getting blackmailed because like this one kid is the only one who knows that he's gay. And like if he came out at that point, he could kind of save himself a lot of trouble, but he doesn't feel ready to yet. Or another example of that, Black Panther, which I don't know that it's so much of a character arc, but it's definitely like the moral argument of the movie is that like T'Challa's first decision when he becomes king is to like preserve Wakanda's secrecy. And if he had just kind of decided what he does at the end to like tell everyone, okay, we have like all the vibranium in the world and we're going to start helping people. If he had decided to do that at the beginning, I think theoretically he could have solved all of his problems, but his decision to like keep it secret sets him off on like this journey that shows him, okay, no, this is not the way to do it. So it seems like to me like the end of Act 1 decision is like kind of this weird thing where it's progress, but also total reversion to like an even worse version of their flaw. But it's kind of necessary in a way for them to change.
Yeah, the other example I usually use is at the end of Act 1, Jack Black decides to use his students to form a new band in School of Rock. Not a good decision in many ways because it sets him up for legal trouble and he gets kicked out of the school and he loses his band.
And he's also using all the kids.
And he's using the kids. It's probably, probably not there's certain ethics violations there, I think.
Right. So we've kind of touched on like the midpoint a bit and the end of Act 1. So what would you say are, and either the other two, you can feel free to jump in on this too. What do you think are like some good examples of like the end of Act 2 or like what the paradigm for that is?
I can do one really quickly, and since you actually brought it up in your introduction, because you said you used the phrase the blue pill, red pill question. So it's really easy to look at structure, especially with action films. And so I'll reference The Matrix, and the decision at the end of Act 1, Neo was presented with the blue pill, red pill. Do you really want to see how far down the rabbit hole goes? And he takes the pill, and he makes that choice, and he immediately, there's all kinds of symbolic stuff that's set up in there. He immediately walks through an opening door that he hadn't seen before. He immediately meets new people, and then he's sucked out of the Matrix. By the midpoint, he goes and sees the Oracle, and at the end of Act 2, Morpheus is trapped, he's been ejected from the Matrix, and he has to make the choice about whether he's going to go back in to save Morpheus. And he makes the decision to go back in, and that leads to him turning into, sort of a martyr towards the end of the film. And most action films, you can almost set your watch to them. I'm excluding superhero films because they're sort of touchy to analyze, just because at this point they're almost exempt from any kind of constraints.
Are you talking about when you say superhero movies? I mean, obviously Endgame is pretty non-traditional in that sense, but if you look at like some of the earlier ones, even within like the connected universe with the MCU, like those seem like they follow pretty standard 3-act structure with like hitting the points at the right minute.
Yeah, I think when you go back and look at them, from the outside, you can identify a 3-act structure, but it depends on what your goal with 3-act structure is. And if you're looking to write something and to manipulate the 3-act structure in order to get a script done, looking at Endgame is probably not your best film to analyze.
Well, I would agree with that, because what is Endgame? Is Endgame a movie, or is it like a season finale for the biggest TV show ever?
Well, right. That's a good question.
Although, like, we actually did an episode on Endgame a few months ago, and like, Jay, you actually brought up in that one, you can kind of split the movie into 3 parts. So, like, it may not be a character journey in the traditional sense. And we didn't go into it and break it down at all, but I think you probably could, at least in terms of, like, the external plot, you could find a lot of those same beats within there without too much trouble. I don't know if that's necessarily like worth getting into for this discussion, but I guess that leads into sort of a question that I had that's kind of a distinction of like, what do we mean when we say 3-act structure? Is it more about like the traditional character journey, or is it more about pacing and like hitting those beats, like making sure that all is lost in a sense at the end of Act 2 or by page 90, like that it has to go through like these certain beats just to have these reversals that keep the audience interested? Like, is that the more important thing when you're looking at writing something in a traditional structure, or is it more that you have the characters change in that like traditional A to B way?
I think they're really tied together. I think that one's a function of another, because we're following the characters and we want to see what happens to them, and what happens to them usually falls along structural points.
That sounds pretty fair. Matt, what were you going to say?
Well, I was going to say I agree with David, and one thing that's occurred to me as we're talking about this is that when structure is divorced from character, that's when it becomes formula. Then the script's hitting certain mechanical beats, but not organically tied in with the character journey.
I think there's a lot to be said for that. I guess the one that came up with this the most when I was looking at it is the first Kingsman movie, where like I think it does hit all of those beats and it feels like it's following the formula, but it's not hitting those beats emotionally. After he fails out of the Kingsman program, there's nothing that really happens character-wise for Eggsy throughout the rest of it. Like, it's just kind of him fighting all the henchmen and stuff. But there's nothing that really changes for him after that point. So, like, there's a bit of a character journey, but the character journey and, like, the structural beats kind of get divorced at that point. It doesn't necessarily make it okay, maybe it does make it a worse movie, but it definitely makes it less cathartic at the end. There's no emotional meat there, I guess.
I can see that. I mean, I enjoyed it, but it clearly came off as, when it was over, it was like, now wait for the next one, because this is going to be a series.
Right, yeah. And I mean, it doesn't lessen my enjoyment of it, because it's not really, it's essentially James Bond in a different form, which, like, I forget which book it was that I was reading, but there was someone that talked about the way that, like, James Bond in a way is, like, the perfect epitome of 3-act structure, but also kind of like the worst version of it, because the whole point of those movies, with the exception of Casino Royale, I would say, is that Bond doesn't change at all. Like, he's perfect. Okay, I'm sure it's very debatable whether he's a perfect guy, because he's very flawed, but, like, in a way, he's exactly who he wants to be. There's not really a change in him from start to end, but at the same time, the story is hitting all of these emotional beats. You always have, like, that inciting incident where the villain's gonna to usually blow something up. And there's like the point, 3/4 of the way through where like he kind of hits rock bottom or is like trapped in a prison, or like the damsel in distress is like about to get eaten by sharks or whatever. I haven't seen so many of them, but like, I mean, the whole point of those is that if you've seen one or two, you've kind of seen all of them. I guess what I'm asking here is like, do we consider that to be closer to three-act structure? Do we consider that to be following it at all? Pacing-wise, it hits all of those beats, but in terms of like a character journey, it doesn't hit any of them. I guess what's kind of the verdict on that?
I think a little bit. With movies like James Bond, I haven't seen Golden Circle. Is Eggsy in that one too?
He is, yeah.
With The King's Man coming out, I think with movies like that, they do that on purpose. So it's more about the structure in those movies, and it's not about the character changing. So I think with movies like Kingsman, it's about them being able to continue the series with a new character if they need somebody different or need to change the story, need to be in a different part of the world or whatever. But yeah, it's with those movies, I don't think it's about connecting to whoever the perfect protagonist is, because like you said with Kingsman, Eggsy doesn't really change. It's not like he's a weak guy to start off with.
I mean, there's a bit of an arc for him. I think you're getting at a really good point of like why it doesn't really work so well emotionally there, because it's not really, he's kind of on rails. He's being dragged along, and kind of like you were saying about like the way that they end it, it's not really about getting him from like a before and after picture. It's more about like, how do we set up the sequel? It's very much the character being at the mercy of the plot rather than like the plot being structured around the character. Do we have any more that we want to say on like just defining what it is?
Sounds like we did a pretty good job of defining it. Something I wanted to say earlier, though, sort of on the subject, sort of not about this structure and our expectations. And this is something I do in class. I might not have done it when you had me, but I frequently say the next assignment is going to be to write a pop song.
Oh, I'm glad you didn't have us do that. I don't think I would have done very well.
But see, here's the thing. Everybody says that, and I say, do you know how to write a pop song? And they say, no, I'm a screenwriting major. I'm a film major. I say, but do you know the structure of a pop song? And people say no. And I say, well, what if I told you it began with the verse? What would come next? And everyone says chorus. Everybody knows the structure of a pop song: verse, chorus, bridge, lead, break, verse, chorus. That's 95% of most pop music. And it's the same thing with movies. I think people know the structure even though they think they don't know it. Everybody knows when you're going to go into a movie, boy meets girl, boy loses girl, boy gets girl back.
Right, yeah. Although I think it's just a little harder for people to articulate it with movies, because with songs, like, you literally have the words and the melodies repeating each other. So it's a little bit easier to see. Sid Field describes it, says it's like a table. There's all different types of tables, but at the end of the day, they all have like 4 legs and a top sitting on it. But there's so much you can do within that structure to make it all different and feel original. I think there's an idea that structure kind of crushes originality, and I'm not quite sure how I feel about that. In a way, I think it does, but maybe it's just that the way people use it isn't very original. I guess a good follow-up to that would be, what do we think are like the benefits of using 3-act structure, and like how can we use it to write the best possible story? Or on a broader sense, is it actually a viable way to like follow these beats and these guidelines to write a good, satisfying story?
I'm going to come out on the side of structure as being, I think, incredibly helpful. Writing a script, especially a feature film script, is a daunting amount of work, and it's really hard to do well. So that anything that is going to help guide you through the process, I think, is a good thing. I think also that if you are someone who resists the idea of 3-act structure and wants to try or find another way, you need to make sure you really understand 3-act structure very well so that you're not doomed to sort of, repeat somebody else's mistakes. A lot of people who come out against 3-act structure have only a shaky idea, in my experience, of what three-act structure actually is and the benefits that's presented to you by embracing it. It's also one of those things, like David said about the pop songs. 95% of movies that are made, at least in commercial release, have a three-act structure. At the other end of things, if you want to make, a very personal, low-budget indie film, all bets are off. And that's the other thing that we should be acknowledging, is that along with your table metaphor, it's a big table and there's room for everybody at it. So if you want to go out and make an unstructured independent film, give it a shot. But we're talking about general ideas about this. So I'm going to say, 95% of stuff is made with a three-act structure. So you need to understand it and then embrace it to whatever degree it's comfortable for you and is going to help you complete the script.
Yeah, I agree that it can be a really useful resource, and some movies just benefit from it where others don't.
So, what do you think we stand to lose by like not using it? And when I say not using it, I guess in a way I am sort of talking about what you were saying, Matt, that like it's something that totally doesn't have like these traditional beats and is kind of art housey. But also when I say not using it, I kind of more so mean like when coming up with a story, you try to not think about it. Not so much that you're consciously trying to keep it from fitting into three acts, just that it's not the model you're using. Because I don't know if this is necessarily the best time to get into it, but there are a couple of other ones that I've found that I'm sort of warming up to. But what do you think writers in general stand to lose by using a different model? I know that may be a little bit of a vague question.
What do you stand to lose if you don't use three-act structure?
Yeah, like, do you think there's something where, like, if you don't use it, maybe, like, your ending won't be satisfying? Because it does kind of give you a template where it's, like, your ending at least feels somewhat satisfying. And, like, I think maybe you stand to lose a little bit of appeal with audiences because, or at least in America, we like our happy endings, and if they don't have it, we're sometimes a bit dissatisfied. And like I guess maybe do we stand to lose just keeping the audience's interest, because like if we don't hit these certain beats, the air might kind of get let out of the balloon a little bit, and like there aren't enough reversals or something. So like I guess what do you think we stand to lose by putting it aside and not using it?
Well, I think it forces, if you choose not to use it, you have to get very creative, because the risk is always, am I going to lose the audience? And so if you don't use three-act structure in the conventional way, you're working outside of the box that most people live in, and you risk losing that audience. And it also forces you outside of your own creative writing box, and you're in uncharted territory, which is not comfortable for everybody.
Okay, that sounds fair. Like you kind of are floating free and have no sort of foundation, I guess, if you don't use it. Or like if you don't use structure at all, I suppose.
I don't know if there's such a thing as not having any structure. I think there's films that have three-act structure, but I think any film has to have some kind of structure, I hope.
Do you think all of them do, or like, because the movie that I think of first as like something that maybe doesn't have any structure is like Boyhood. There's stuff that happens, but that's kind of it. It's just sort of stuff happening. And I think that's sort of like the epitome of what you risk by not using it. There is a character story there, but the events aren't really that connected to each other that much. It's just kind of like we're sort of getting a highlight reel, and there's nothing that's really like greater than the sum of its parts. I'm sorry to like, if that sounds like I'm trashing on Boyhood too much, but like it's a complaint I've heard a lot where people are just like, it's 2.5 hours of him just kind of existing.
I'll take the counterpoint on that and just say that it may not have sort of what we think of as a conventional three-act structure, but Linklater is imposing a certain kind of structure on it just because of the way the film's organized. If you're going to come back to the same place with the same performers on a regular, 12-year schedule, you're putting a structure on that. It may not be conventional three-act structure, but it is organized in a particular way. Whether you think it's effective or whether you enjoy what's going on or not are sort of separate questions. But maybe that answers your earlier question, thinking that a lack of conventional structure may alienate an audience.
Yeah, I think Boyhood's maybe an extreme example of that. I've heard people say that like there's other ones that kind of don't follow, and then other people will come back and say that yes, they do. It's just a little harder to see. But is it fair to say that like not using three-act structure reduces your commercial appeal? Maybe not like as a universal rule, but pretty close to that.
I think it's automatically going to cut off some commercial avenues for you. But I'll also say that the thing about not using conventional three-act structure is that you want to ask yourself whether whatever you're pursuing, whatever story you're writing, are you pursuing the structure or the story the way you're writing it because that's the best way to tell the story, or are you just reacting against three-act structure? Because there's plenty of people that also set out without any kind of intention to follow any of the mainstream screenwriting writers, and they'll just set out to write their script, and they create a script and unintentionally end up with a script that has three acts. Just because that mode of storytelling is so ingrained, especially in Western society, that you have to actually work really hard to get away from it.
Well, I would agree with that for movies, but we've started like it's pretty hard to come up with a solid example that like really doesn't follow three-act structure and also like actually works pretty well. But I mean, I think there's still structure there, but it's a bit harder to tell is with like the newer versions of TV, like the old model of TV where you had commercials, like you literally had the acts divided by commercial breaks. But nowadays, where you can watch all of Stranger Things in one sitting, there's kind of no rules, I guess, and you can kind of meander. Do we think there's anything to be said for like the fact that you can kind of structure stories in like a bit of a different way and still be appealing? Because I think a lot of people are gravitating toward TV shows now because they aren't as predictable and can kind of do what they want a little bit more.
Yeah, I think there is, because there's so many ways to see content now. It used to be TV and movies, now it's TV, movies, streaming, whatever. And because TV has evolved so much in the last few years, I think people are taking risks and doing things differently. You know, it is a risk. In class last week, I showed an episode of Parks and Recreation, which I love. You know, I would make the point too that, you know, at its height, Parks and Recreation was getting, I think, like 1.2 million viewers a week, as opposed to something like The Big Bang Theory, which is getting 18, 19, 20, 21 million viewers a week. And it hit me for the first time, oh, I can see why people might not like Parks and Recreation. They might not get it. It just doesn't have that same appeal. It appeals to me, but I'm not everybody. I've never seen The Big Bang Theory.
Do you think there's like a way that Parks and Rec breaks a convention that Big Bang Theory follows that maybe is like a reason for that?
Well, I think in this case, I think it's a style. I mean, Parks and Recreation had a very dry sense of humor and kind of sophisticated that, I mean, honestly, not to sound like, you know, an elitist intellectual snob or anything, a lot of people just wouldn't get. Big Bang Theory, as far as I can tell, is pretty standard by the books TV comedy.
So you think it's just kind of broad appeal versus like niche appeal? It's just a little bit safer to go the broad route.
Yeah, and you know, what somebody said, security or safety is the enemy of creativity.
It's an interesting theory.
I just, you know, take him or it as you will. I just saw a quote from Woody Allen who said, if you're not failing every now and then, you're probably not doing something very interesting, not taking risks, not challenging. It's easy to sit back and do things by the books. That's why they're there. That's why there's There's screenwriting books. I think, well, one, mostly, I think there's screenwriting books to sell screenwriting books because they know people are interested. There's a market for people who want to learn screenwriting.
And they're kind of, it's not clickbait, but they kind of have clickbaity titles where it's like the last screenwriting book you'll ever need to read. And they really sell themselves as like knowing everything about it.
Yeah, it's interesting. I saw something not long ago. Sid Field's book came out in 1979, and somebody went back and looked that up to that point in 1979, in the New York Times, when talking about film, the word structure appeared maybe once. And since 1979, since Sid Field, the word structure, when talking about screenplays and movies, has appeared thousands of times.
Wow, okay. So, last question to round it out. This is sort of a broad one. What do we mean when we say that something is well structured? I have a couple of ideas that like I'm not totally sold on, but I like how they sound. In a way, I think maybe could we say that it means like everything happens when it's supposed to, or like that everything's given kind of like the proper time and attention that's appropriate to its weight in the story?
I'll jump in. I think it's about pacing. I think if the story is engaging, then it was well structured. I'm thinking about, very specifically about a film that was out a few years ago, 20th Century Women, which was nominated for Best Original Screenplay Oscar. And I was literally on the edge of my seat in the theater watching it thinking, I don't know where this is going. I can't figure this out. How is this going to end? And it wasn't an action movie. It was just a simple domestic drama. And I was so engaged with it and grabbed by it that I found it really compelling. And it doesn't follow 3-act structure. That Witherspoon movie, Wild, a little while ago, and it didn't keep my attention. It wasn't well structured, I thought.
So those are both things that kind of, one like goes away from like the traditional 3-act effectively, and one does it kind of ineffectively.
Yeah.
I would just say I think it sort of depends on who's actually saying that. If it's a comment that a reader is putting on a script, then it could be just sort of a seal of approval, like, yeah, this person kind of knows what they're doing. If it's a post-release of the film critic saying it, then who knows? It sounds like one of those kind of generic comments that's really hard to parse out.
I kind of agree with both perspectives, but I'd agree with David more saying, it has to do with keeping your attention. It doesn't have to follow 3-act structure in order to be well structured.
Okay.
I have a question I'm going to throw out there. Does a movie like Forrest Gump follow the 3-act structure? Because he doesn't really change during that movie and stuff sort of just happens to him, but that movie kept me engaged the entire time, so...
I hadn't thought of that as a counterpoint, but I think it very well could be. Yeah, because I guess he doesn't really have an arc. I've kind of been thinking about it too in the sense that like even a sports game can be considered to be well structured. Feel free to disagree with me on this, but I think we qualify like a game as being good for a lot of the same reasons we might with a story. If you can predict what the end is going to be early, then we'd say like, oh, it was like kind of lame. Like there was no real tension because one team's up by like a ton and like we know what's going to happen halfway through. And in that sense, like that kind of gets us checked out of a movie too. If we can predict what's going to happen by 30 minutes in, and we already know how it's going to end, we're a little bit checked out. But then at the same time, like if there's like a major comeback after that point, then we're like even more engaged. Although I don't know if that's the best model to follow, but I'm wondering if that's maybe something that we could look at as a good model for structure. Is obviously there's more real tension because it's not planned out like a story is, but there's like reversals and it's keeping us on the edge of our seat. Do you think there's anything to be said for like using that as a model for what we qualify as well structured?
Yeah, I remember in '05 when the Eagles went to the Super Bowl, it was widely predicted that they would lose the game, and they did. Everybody knew they were going to lose going into it. Maybe they didn't. Don't tell them I said that. But it was still an engaging game. It was still an entertaining game to watch.
Well, in that sense, it's also like really high stakes, so you have like bigger expectations, which I think maybe there's a movie equivalent of that, but I'm not quite sure what it is.
I would say that with the sports side of things, that's the extreme end of structure because there's a clock running usually, or there's some kind of organizational method that makes things happen in certain ways. There's also a pretty extensive rule book usually that goes along with most sporting events that the spectator is already aware of, so they can place the conflict between the opposing forces in that context.
So I wonder if it deals with expectations then. Because I heard, like, I didn't watch it, but this past Super Bowl I heard from everybody that it was really boring and straightforward. So I wondered if it had to do with, who people really expected to win the Super Bowl and then that team winning without anything interesting happening in between.
Yeah, I think what people were referring to for the last one, I don't think I saw the whole thing, but it was more that like nothing really happened. It was like super low scoring. There was just so little that happened, which there's something to be said for that too, because like, do we consider that to be worse structured than something where it's like everything happens all the time? Like a game that's 50 points for a movie that's like Mad Max, where it's like explosions every 20 seconds and like stuff's always happening, versus something where like nothing happens, but it's not necessarily less reversals. Do you guys have anything else you want to add?
Well, I just want to say to anybody who's still listening, thanks for listening. I think we covered like a really wide range of stuff here. And if you're new to this can be incredibly overwhelming.
Yeah, I agree. Thanks for listening. My thing is, and I even say this on the first day of Intro to Screenwriting, that I teach screenwriting with training wheels. That you learn a very strict conservative version of 3-act structure. Nobody ever won the Tour de France riding on training wheels, though. So I think it's important to know. I guess the point I always say is know the rules before you break them. And the example, again, going back to pop music, is remember that the Beatles started out as a cover band. They started out doing versions of standardly structured pop songs, did that for 5 or 6 years, and then broke all the rules. And I think it worked out.
Okay, I do have a couple of just quick boilerplate things. This is kind of meant to be like an introduction into like a few episodes where we're going to be talking a little bit about like how individual movies deal with structure. And also, like, this is going to be the only episode where we talk exclusively about 3-act structure. Like, the later ones, we're going to talk about, like, all other things, and, like, structure is just going to be a segment on it, probably near the end. So it's not going to be all about that. If people were a little confused or, like, didn't quite enjoy this one as much, this is probably the only time we're going to be doing that. Otherwise, send in comments to erw58@drexel.edu. You can leave us ratings on iTunes and like us on Facebook. Credit to the logo by Isabella Akhtarshinas. Do you guys want to leave any information where people can like find you on social media or like send in questions that they might have or anything?
All over the internet.
Call my
you can
agent.
Find us. If you're looking, the best place to find me is on Instagram. My handle is Script King.
Instagram as Base Phoenix, no space, all lowercase.
Yeah, you can find me on Instagram too. I'm False Climax.
Okay.
It's a screenwriting term.
So I think that just about wraps things up. Thanks to all three of you for coming on for this episode. I think we definitely had some insightful discussion on this, and we'll be doing other stuff in the future. So if you guys want to come back on again sometime, like,
Yeah, definitely.
you're certainly welcome to. But
Thanks.
until next time.